You walked into my city carrying something. I want to know who sent you. Right now.
The same people who are coming for you whether I speak or not.
Whatever you are carrying, Chair, whatever you came here to do, look me in the eye and tell me it meant nothing.
It meant everything. That is exactly why I could not finish it.
You have 30 seconds to tell me the truth before I stop being the one keeping you alive. The voice came from behind her. Zara did not turn around. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the 31st floor apartment, both hands loose at her sides, looking out at the harbour lights scattered across the dark water below like something broken and still beautiful. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, jaw-cut, blood-dried at the corner of her mouth, her thick coils falling loose around her face. She looked like a woman who had already survived the worst part of the night. She was not sure that was true. She could see him in her reflection. Kim Jae-won. Standing in the center of the room behind her, hands inside his pockets, platinum blonde hair slightly undone, the tiger tattoo climbing the left side of his neck above his collar. Still, completely still. The way very dangerous things go still right before they decide to move. 30 seconds, he said again, quieter this time. That was worse. Somewhere behind him, closer to the door, she could feel Park Hyun-soo. She could not see him in the glass, but she knew he was there, the way you know a fire is somewhere near you, by the heat, by the change in the air. She could hear him breathing. He was not as controlled as his brother. He never had been. And right now, the sound of his breathing told her that whatever was about to happen in this room was the kind of thing that could not be undone once it started. She closed her eyes. She had arrived in Busan 4 months ago with one suitcase and a mission, and the name of a dead man in her phone. And she had told herself she was going to be clean about it. Fast. Precise. Gone before it became anything other than a transaction. It had become everything. Zara. Hyun-soo's voice now, low, and the thing inside it, the way her name sounded in his mouth like something he was afraid of losing, was the thing that finally made her turn around. She turned and faced them both, 2 men in a high room above the harbour, 2 men who looked at her like they already knew the answer and were giving her the grace of saying it herself, 2 men whose lives she had come to this city to end. She looked at Jae-won first, then at Hyun-soo. Then she breathed in slowly through her nose and she said, "My father's name was Zara Adeyemi. He is the man who killed yours." The harbour was completely silent 31 floors below. Neither of them moved. "And I," she said, "was sent here to finish what he started. Wherever you are watching this, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far a story about a woman who arrived with a mission and left with something she never planned to carry can travel. And if this story found you at a moment when you needed to be reminded that the life you were handed is not the life you are required to live, that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is walk into a room, tell the truth, and stand still while the world decides what to do with it, then you already know why you need to see what happens next. Subscribe, because you just saw the end of who Zara was when she arrived. Now it is time to go back and see how she became this woman standing in this room. And neither, I think, are you ready for all of it. Now let's go back to where it all began. She had arrived in Busan on a Tuesday in October, when the air off the water was cold enough to bite, but the sky was the kind of pale blue that makes you forget, briefly, what trouble you were carrying. She had one suitcase, a Nigerian passport with a Korean visa that had cost someone a great deal of money to arrange, and a name she was supposed to find. She had not arrived as a tourist. She had not arrived as a student. She had arrived as a woman carrying an assignment she had not chosen, wrapped inside a grief she had not yet been permitted to put down, moving through a city that did not know her name and did not know what she had been sent here to do. Zara Adeyemi was 27 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's sins, and she had been living in the space between those two things for as long as she could remember. Her mother, Folake, had been a quiet woman from Lagos, who worked in a small fabric shop in Surulere, and who loved palm wine and bad Nigerian movies, and who had died 3 years ago of a heart that simply gave out, leaving behind a daughter who now knew things about the man who had fathered her that no daughter should ever have to know. Her father, she could not call him that anymore without something acidic rising in her chest, was Zara Adeyemi, a name that meant nothing in the circles she had grown up in, a name that meant everything in certain rooms in Seoul and Busan, and the back offices of organizations that did not have websites or addresses, or any public record of existing at all. Emmanuel had been a fixer, an intermediary, a man who moved between African crime networks and Korean ones with a smile and a handshake, and a gift for making people trust him long enough for it to cost them everything they had. He had died 4 years ago in a car accident that was not an accident, and when he died, the organization he had worked for had decided that his blood debt did not die with him, that his daughter, who had inherited his face and apparently his capacity for disappearing into unfamiliar places and making them feel like somewhere she had always been, was a useful thing to have in their possession. They had found Zara 3 months after her mother's funeral, which was either very precise timing or the kind of cruelty that presents itself as patience. A man named Director Choi had sat across from her in a quiet restaurant on Lagos Island and told her very gently, as if he were explaining something unfortunate but inevitable, that her father had been responsible for the death of a man named Park Sung-jin, the patriarch of one of the most powerful crime families in Busan, and that this debt was known and that it was coming for her eventually, unless she chose to be useful first. Being useful meant going to Busan. It meant finding employment near the Kim Park operations. It meant gathering intelligence. It meant, eventually, when the time was right and the access was sufficient, being present at a particular meeting and pressing a particular button on a particular device. Both brothers, in one room, gone. A clean operation. A statement about the cost of unpaid debts. What Director Choi had not told her, what she had only discovered later, in fragments, in the quiet of her small apartment near Nampodong, was that Park Sung-jin had not been a good man, that he had been, in many ways, the kind of man the world does not mourn honestly, and that the 2 sons he had left behind had not simply inherited an empire, they had inherited a fracture. Kim Jae-won, who had been adopted and given the Kim name but shared blood with the Parks, raised by the patriarch's iron hand and shaped by it in ways that had made him precise and controlled and capable of great coldness. And Park Hyun-soo, the biological son, who had grown up in the shadow of the same man and had turned out entirely different, louder, warmer, more reckless, as if in direct opposition to everything his father had tried to make of the world. These 2 men had split a city between them after their father's death. They had divided the restaurants and the ports and the territories and the grief, and they had not spoken properly in 2 years. And Zara had been sent into the middle of all of it. She found the restaurant the way things find you, when the universe is not finished with you yet. Haenyo sat on a narrow street 3 blocks from the waterfront with paper lanterns strung outside, and a menu that moved between traditional Korean cooking and something that had been touched by whoever had last run the kitchen with real ambition. She knew it was a front within the first week, the back room that stayed locked regardless of how busy the dining room got, the men who came in at hours that had nothing to do with meal times and spoke to the owner in voices too low for the dining room, the cash that moved without receipts and without record. She catalogued all of it. She sent careful, minimal reports to Director Choi's contact number. She told herself she was doing exactly what she had been sent to do. Madame Song hired her without too many questions, which was either a sign of trust or a sign that she saw something in Zara's face that recognized another woman who had learned not to ask too many questions herself. The work steadied her in a way she had not expected. The weight of the trays, the rhythm of the morning prep and the evening close, the Korean vocabulary expanding daily under Madame Song's corrections and occasional approvals. It gave her body something to do while her mind ran its calculations. She was good at both. She had always been good at being multiple things at the same time. She had not expected to love Haenyo. She had not expected the smell of the jjigae in the morning, and the sound of the kitchen at full speed, and the way the lanterns outside turned the street gold in the evening to become things she looked forward to. She had not expected the restaurant to start feeling like somewhere she belonged. That was the most dangerous development of all. And she noted it and kept working and told herself it was useful cover to feel at home, and not that she actually was. She had definitely not expected Park Hyun-soo. He came in on a Wednesday 3 weeks into her time at Henyo. And he came in the way weather comes in, announcing itself before it arrived, filling the space before his body did. He had 2 men behind him, and a phone pressed to his ear, and a voice that took up the entire restaurant from the moment the door opened, and she turned from the table she was clearing with the quick professional assessment she had trained in herself. A full read of a person in under 3 seconds. Navy suit slightly open at the collar, dark hair pushed back messily, that crane tattoo visible above his collar on the right side of his neck. Broad-shouldered and physical, and carrying the specific energy of a man who has spent his life in rooms where everyone watches him, and has learned to occupy that attention rather than shrink from it. He sat at the center table without being shown to it, which told her everything about his relationship to the building. She brought him water without being asked. It was instinct and also intelligence gathering, and she could no longer fully separate the two. He looked up at her and went completely still. Not the way men sometimes went still when they noticed a beautiful woman. This was different in quality, and she registered the difference immediately. This was the stillness of someone who had been genuinely surprised by something they had not prepared for. Like she was a sentence in a language he did not speak, but understood somewhere below the level of language, in the place where people recognize things before they can explain them. "You're new," he said, in Korean. 3 weeks, she answered, also in Korean, and watched his eyebrows lift. "You speak well." "I studied." "Where are you from?" "Nigeria." He smiled then, full and unguarded and completely without calculation, a smile that changed the entire geometry of his face, and made him look briefly like someone younger than his authority suggested. And she held it in her gaze for exactly 1 second longer than was professional, and then turned away to take the order from the table beside his. Behind her, she heard him say something quiet to his men, and heard one of them laugh, and she kept her pace steady and even, and went to the kitchen and stood at the prep counter, and breathed carefully through her nose and acknowledged, privately and with some alarm, that she was already in a specific kind of trouble. He came back on Friday. He came back the following Wednesday. He started arriving alone. He started sitting at the same table. He started ordering whatever she recommended, which was either genuine trust or an elaborate excuse to keep talking to her, and she suspected it was both in proportions she could not precisely measure. It was raining hard 3 Wednesdays into this pattern, when she had to run to the street entrance for something, and he appeared at the kitchen entrance before she reached it, and before she could register what was happening, his jacket was over her head, and he was holding it there with one arm raised above her, his body warm and close in the cold, wet air, smelling of something expensive and clean underneath the rain. She turned beneath the jacket to look up at him, and they were suddenly much closer than the logistics of the situation required, and the rain was loud on the awning above them, and his dark eyes were right there, amused and warm and very focused, and the crane tattoo was at his throat, and she told herself to step back and create appropriate professional distance. She did not step back. "I have an umbrella inside," she said. "Too far," he said, and the smile was already there. They stood under his jacket in the rain for a duration that was entirely too long for the situation to remain professional, and she memorized his face against her will, and told herself she was reading a subject, and not a person, and then stepped back inside, and felt the warmth of where he had been standing for the next 30 minutes. Kim Jae-won came for the first time on a Thursday, 6 weeks into her employment, and he came the way very controlled things move, quietly, with intention, without announcing anything. He sat at the table near the window, ordered green tea and John, opened a leather folder of documents, and did not look up for the first 20 minutes she was aware of him. Black suit perfectly tailored, platinum blonde hair immaculate, the tiger tattoo visible at his collar on the left side when she set his tea down. She recognized him from the description she had been given, and her pulse did something she did not have a professional explanation for. He looked up when she set the cup down. A single glance, brief and precise. He looked back at his documents. Then, slowly, as if against a specific internal instruction, he looked up again. "Thank you," he said. Quiet, controlled, measured. "Of course," she said. She walked the full length of the dining room back to the kitchen and felt his attention on her back the entire way, a quality of focus so concentrated it was almost physical. She went to the kitchen and stood at the prep counter and pressed her palms flat on the cool surface and told herself 4 times that this was information gathering. She did not believe herself once. He came back every Thursday. He never came on Wednesdays. Hyun-soo never came on Thursdays. She noticed this pattern before she understood it, and when she understood it, that they had divided even this restaurant between them the way they had divided the city, silently and completely. The knowledge settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she understood about what she was doing here. Hyun-soo asked her to walk with him on an evening in November, when the ginkgo trees had turned the street outside Haenyeo entirely gold. He asked in the way that people who are not accustomed to asking for things ask, directly, with his expression arranged in a studied casualness that was not casual at all. "It is too cold," she said. "I'll keep you warm," he said, with the grin already assembled. "That is a terrible line. I know, I'm better in person." She walked with him. He bought tteokbokki from a street vendor and they ate standing up in the cold with the rice cakes burning their fingers, and he talked about Busan the way people talk about a place they love and resent in equal measure, which is to say the way people talk about home. He knew every street and every smell and every back alley, and he hated that he knew all of it and could not imagine being anywhere else. He told her about growing up near the water. He told her his mother had died when he was 8, and that after that the sea had been the only thing that felt entirely honest to him, because it did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. He told her there were very few things in his life that had ever felt that honest. He was looking directly at her when he said that last part. She looked back at him in the gold and dark of that Busan street, rice cake grease on both their fingers and cold air turning their breath visible, and she thought, "You should not be telling me these things. You should not be looking at me this way. I am going to destroy your life and your brother's life and everything your dead father built, and you do not know that yet. And the only reason we are both still standing here in the warm light is because you do not know it yet." She said, "My mother died when I was 24. He went quiet and still, and nodded slowly, and the silence that followed was worth more than anything he could have said. They walked back slowly, and he did not reach for her hand, and she understood that this restraint was costing him something, that he was capable of it even when it went against everything his nature wanted, and she filed that away in the part of her that was still attempting to see him only as a subject of intelligence gathering. That part of her was losing badly. Hyun-soo kissed her for the first time 2 weeks after that walk. It was not planned. Nothing about Hyun-soo was planned. They had come back from the pojangmacha by the water, soju and warmth, and his hand brushing hers 3 times on the table, without either of them acknowledging it, and he had stopped walking on the way back, and she had taken 2 steps before realizing, and turned to find him standing on the pavement looking at her, with an expression so completely undefended that it stopped her mid-step. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You. Just you standing there." She looked at him in the dark Busan street with his hands in his pockets, and his dark hair pushed back by the wind, and the crane tattoo above his collar, and she thought, "You are going to ruin me." She thought, "I am going to ruin you first, and I am so deeply, irreparably sorry for it." He closed the space between them in 2 steps and kissed her, warm and certain and tasting of soju, and something fiercer and more permanent underneath. And she kissed him back with her hands pressing flat against his chest, feeling the solid reality of him and her eyes burning with something that had nothing to do with the cold wind. He pulled back and rested his forehead against hers and held it there, and they stood in that suspended moment, with their breath mingling in the cold air, and neither of them said anything, and the harbour was dark and distant, and the city was alive around them, and she thought, "I cannot do this. I am already doing this. There is no version of stopping this that I know how to execute anymore." She went home and stood at her window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass and said, in Yoruba, very quietly, "Mama, what have I done?" Jaewon touched her hand on a Thursday in mid-December. She had set his tea down, and he had reached for it at the exact same moment. and his fingers closed around the cup precisely where hers still rested. And neither of them moved for a moment that was 3 seconds long and contained an entire conversation. She released the cup. He lifted it. Neither of them spoke, but something had been declared in that silence, something that existed below the level of language, in the register where people acknowledge things they are not yet prepared to say out loud. He walked her to the bus stop that evening for the first time. His men trailed at a respectful distance and the winter city was quiet around them, and he walked beside her with his hands in his pockets and said nothing for 2 full blocks. And she matched his silence because she had already understood that silence with Jaewon was not empty. It was its own kind of presence. It was what he gave you when words were insufficient. At the bus stop, he turned to face her and looked at her with those dark eyes that processed everything. "You are not afraid of me," he said. "Should I be?" He considered this genuinely. "Most people are." "I know," she said. And yet, she agreed. The bus came and she got on and looked back from the window, and he was standing at the stop with his hands in his pockets and the tiger tattoo at his jaw and his platinum hair in the winter dark, watching the bus go until it turned the corner. And she closed her eyes and felt something inside her chest vibrate like a wire that had been struck by something it had been waiting for. She was somewhere between falling and fallen, and she could no longer measure the distance between the 2 states. And she was not sure, standing in that knowledge, that she wanted to. Jaewon spoke to her for the first time beyond the transactional on a different Thursday, when she was clearing the table beside his, and he said without looking up from his documents, "You are always watching." She stopped. "I am a waitress." "Not the way you watch." He turned a page. "You watch the exits. You count the men. You clock every person who comes through the back." She kept her face still. "You count the men too." He looked up then, slowly and deliberately. "Yes," he said, "I do." He held her gaze for a moment, and in it was the beginning of a question he was not yet ready to ask. "We have that in common." She walked away, and her hands were steady, and her heart was not. And that gap between the two was getting wider every week. He gave her his umbrella one Thursday when it started raining as she was leaving, and he was still at his table. She started to say something, and he said, without looking up, "I have a car." And she stood in the doorway of Haenyeo with his umbrella in her hand, and looked back at him and felt the warmth of that small, deliberate thing spread through her, like something she'd been cold without for a long time. Hyun-soo came to find her on a night in late December, when she was closing the restaurant alone. She heard the back door and turned with a prep knife already in her hand, fast and low and ready. And he stopped dead in the doorway with both hands raised and looked at the knife, and then at her face, and said nothing for a moment. "Remind me never to startle you," he said. She lowered the knife slowly. Her heart was loud. "You should knock." "I did. You didn't hear me." He came in slowly, reading her face in the dim restaurant light. "What happened tonight? You look like you've been carrying something all evening." "I am always carrying something." He crossed the restaurant in 8 deliberate steps and stood in front of her, and put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her with that full, unguarded attention she could never fully prepare herself for. The crane tattoo was at his collar, and his dark eyes were steady, and she felt the weight of everything she was carrying shift slightly, as if his presence alone was redistributing it across more surface area. "Let me help," he said, simply, without conditions. She looked at him and wanted to say yes. She wanted to give him every piece of it. Instead, she reached up and took his face in her hands and kissed him, and it was different from the first time. Slower, more deliberate, less recklessness and more intention. The kind of kiss that is a statement rather than a question. He made a sound low in his chest and pulled her in closer, and she felt his arms come around her and the warmth of his body in the cold, empty restaurant, and she thought, "I will remember this exact moment. Whatever happens after this, whatever I have to become and whatever I lose in becoming it, I will remember his arms and the smell of the harbour through the walls and the upturned chairs around us like silent witnesses." He pulled back and pressed his lips to her forehead and held them there. She closed her eyes. "Zara," he said into her hair. "Don't," she whispered. Don't what? Don't say the big thing yet. Not yet. He held her tighter and said nothing, and she was grateful beyond what words could reach. January arrived, and the shift in everything came before she could fully prepare for it. More traffic through the back of the restaurant. Different men on different days, carrying the specific body language of people on the edge of something. Hyun-soo came in some nights with his jaw set and his eyes somewhere else, and one Wednesday, 2 men came in behind him with the deliberate body language of a confrontation that had been decided before they walked through the door. She watched from the dining room as Hyun-soo turned before they reached him. He turned slowly, almost lazily, as if he had eyes in the back of his head, which, she was beginning to understand, he effectively did. The first man grabbed his collar, and the sequence that followed was so fast it looked choreographed. Hyun-soo's elbow went backward into the man's jaw before the grip fully tightened. He pivoted on his left foot, caught the second man's swinging arm at the wrist, locked it, turned his whole body into the movement, and the man folded to his knees on the restaurant floor with the sound of something being asked to bend in a direction it refused. Hyun-soo stood over both of them and straightened his suit jacket with both hands and looked at Madame Song in the kitchen doorway. "I'll pay for the floor," he said. "There is nothing wrong with the floor," she said. "Get them out." He got them out. He came back and sat at his table, and she brought him water without being asked, exactly as she had the very first night, and he looked up at her and the grin was there, that infuriating, impossible, completely genuine grin, and she shook her head and walked away, and heard him laugh quietly behind her, and felt warmth move through her chest, like something she could not afford. Jaewon intervened for her on a Thursday in January, and he did it so efficiently, and with so little performance, that she almost did not register it as what it was. A man had been watching her from a corner table all evening, thick-necked, expensive watch, the specific entitlement of someone who has never needed to consider whether a room wanted him in it. When she came past with a loaded tray, he stepped into her path and said something in dialect she did not catch, but understood completely from tone and posture, and she set the tray on the nearest surface and turned to face him and said in clear, precise Korean, "Move." He smiled, instead of moving. The kind of smile that is a declaration of what he believes the power structure to be. He reached out and put his hand on her arm. The next thing she registered was Jaewon behind the man, having crossed the entire dining room in the time it took the hand to extend, holding him by the collar with one hand in the efficient, unhurried manner of someone performing a task they find mildly inconvenient. He turned the man toward the door and walked him out without a word. The man's 3 companions read the room and followed immediately. Jaewon came back and bent down and collected the items that had slid from her tray and set them on the table, and then looked at her. "I was handling it," she said. "I know," he said. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." And then, so quietly it was almost to himself, "I know you were. I did it anyway." She looked at him, at this precise, controlled, devastatingly careful man who had just crossed a room for her without making it a statement, without requiring acknowledgement, without asking for anything in return. And something in the wall she maintained between what she was permitted to feel and what she actually felt developed a crack she could not repair. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and returned to his table and picked up his documents, and she stood in the center of the dining room, with her heart doing things that had nothing to do with professional intelligence work. That night he walked with her to the bus stop, and at the stop he turned and reached out, and with 2 fingers turned her face gently toward the streetlight, and looked at her arm where the man had grabbed her. His touch was barely a touch at all, a ghost of contact, his thumb a whisper against her skin as he checked. She watched his face while he looked, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. Not fully open. Jaewon was never fully open. But the door was cracked, and through the crack was something enormous, and carefully maintained and completely real. He released her face and put his hand back in his pocket, and looked at the street and said nothing. "It is nothing," she said. "I know," he said. He did not look at her when he said it, and his jaw was tight, and she understood that this was what it looked like when Jaewon felt something he had not planned to feel, and had not yet found the correct way to contain it. The bus came. She got on. She looked back, and he lifted his hand once in that private, not quite wave, and she pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and held it there and felt the imprint of his 2 fingers on her face for the entire ride home and most of the night after. She did not sleep. She sat at her table with the laptop open and Director Choi's report template on the screen untouched, and she looked at it for a long time. The device was in the lining of a bag in her wardrobe. She had not opened the bag since it arrived. She had been telling Choi's contact she was waiting for more access, more intelligence, better positioning, and every morning she woke up knowing she was lying, and every night she went to sleep having made no move toward the bag, and told herself she was still deciding. She had decided. She had known it for weeks. She was not going to do it. She looked at the report template on the screen, and she thought about Hyun-soo's forehead against hers in the cold restaurant. She thought about Jae-won's 2 fingers at her face. She thought about the way the harbour looked from the bus window at night, and the way this city had become, against every intention she had arrived with, something that felt like hers. She thought about her mother. Your eyes are too big for trouble, Omomi. They will always give you away. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark and breathed. Choi moved before she was ready. The man who had watched her from the restaurant table. She had made him the first time and not the second. A mistake born of divided. A tension that she would not forgive herself for. Had gone through her apartment while she was at work and found the device still in the bag lining, untriggered, and the file on her laptop with both brothers' names and every piece of intelligence she had gathered over 4 months. And he had made a call, and by the time she came home that evening and found the lock broken, and the bag moved and the laptop open on the file she had not left open, she knew exactly what had been set in motion and how little time she had. She was 3 blocks from Haenyeo when they took her. 2 men, fast and professional. From a parked car she had not clocked because her mind was running through scenarios rather than watching the street. She had time to break the first man's grip and drive her elbow across his face hard enough to feel it. He went sideways and she turned for the second one and almost made it. Before the second man took her from behind, and then there was a car door, and then there was darkness. And then there was the warehouse. The warehouse at the southern dock smelled of salt water and rust, and the metallic thing underneath both that she had come to understand was the smell of other people's fear, accumulated in a space over years. Her back against a steel column, wrists bound tight behind her, a single hanging bulb swinging above her head and throwing everything in shifting shadow. 6 men in dark suits standing in a half circle around her, and Kim Jae-won directly in front of her, hands in his pockets, completely still, the tiger tattoo at his jaw in the cold light looking like something with its own intention. "Tell me who sent you," he said. She held his gaze and said nothing. He crouched slowly to her level, and his face was close, and the cold light caught every precise line of it, and his voice dropped to something that was barely sound at all. "I do not ask twice." The door on the far side of the warehouse came off its hinges. Not dramatically, practically. The steel door crashed flat onto the concrete floor with a sound that hit the chest before the ears registered it. And through the opening came Park Hyun-soo, and he was already moving before the door finished falling. Shirt sleeves rolled, crane tattoo above his collar, and he hit the first man with his elbow before the man finished turning, the sound of it hollow and final. Pivoted immediately into the second, taking a grab at his collar and using the man's own weight and momentum to spin him off balance and drive him into the nearest wall. 2 men came at him together, and he stepped into them rather than back, which was entirely characteristic. Dropping under the first swing, coming up inside the second man's reach and lifting with his whole body, and the man went over his shoulder and down hard on the concrete. 3 more of Jae-won's men moved toward him, and the fight that followed was the kind that consumes a space entirely. Hyun-soo took a chair across his shoulders that staggered him, and he absorbed it and turned and drove the man who had swung it backward across a metal drum and held him there with one forearm across his chest. He took a punch to the jaw that split his lip, and he hit back twice as hard and did not stop moving. A man grabbed him from behind and he threw his head back and connected, and the grip broke and he was already turning. "Get away from her." His voice filled the warehouse. Jae-won stood up and turned to face his brother, and the air between them was the specific air that exists only between people who share blood and a history of unresolved damage. "You followed me," Jae-won said. "I followed her," Hyun-soo said, his chest rising and falling hard, his dark eyes moving to Zara's face and something shifting in him that was past strategy and past anger. "Let her go. She was found with a phone that had our father's name in it." The warehouse went completely silent. Zara closed her eyes. "Let her go." Hyun-soo took a step forward. 3 of Jae-won's men moved. The entire room balanced on the edge of something that could not be recalled once it tipped. Jae-won looked back at Zara. She met his gaze without flinching, jaw bleeding, hair loose, wrists raw, standing as straight as the column behind her would allow. And he looked at her, really looked, with the full precision of his attention, and something shifted in his certainty. Not softness. Something more structural than softness. The specific shift of a man who has built a conclusion on a foundation, and has found a crack in the foundation. "Cut her loose," he said. The knife came, and the binding gave way, and she brought her arms forward, and her shoulders screamed, and she did not make a sound. She stood on her own, and she looked at Jae-won, and she did not look away. "This is not finished," he said. "No," she said, blood drying on her jaw. "It is not." Jae-won drove her to his doctor himself, a quiet man in a residential building in Haeundae who asked no questions and cleaned her jaw and pressed butterfly strips to it and told her she was fortunate. Hyun-soo sat in the waiting room with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and his head low, that crane tattoo at his collar, and he looked like a man performing the most difficult version of stillness he had ever attempted. She came out and he stood up and looked at her face, and then he crossed the room and pulled her into him completely. And she went, pressing her face into his neck and gripping the back of his jacket, and feeling the shaking in his arms that he was trying to suppress and not quite managing. "I was 20 seconds behind you the entire time," he said into her hair. 20 seconds, and I could not close it, and I have never... He stopped. His arms tightened. "I have never felt like that." "I know," she said quietly. "I'm here. You're bleeding. Butterfly strips. Zara." He pulled back and held her face in both hands, his split lip dark with dried blood, his eyes going over every part of her face with an intensity that was past what she had seen from him before. "Don't disappear on me. Do you understand me? Do not disappear." She looked at him and felt the truth of what he was saying and the truth of what she was about to say land in her chest at the same moment. "There are things I need to tell you," she said. "Both of you." He searched her face. Something in him went very still. "How bad?" he said. She held his gaze. "All the way," she said. They went to Jae-won's apartment. 31st floor, harbour below, the kind of space that expressed power without visibly enjoying it. Austere and clean and lived in by someone who was accustomed to having things without being softened by them. She sat on the couch. Both men stood. She looked at her hands in her lap for one moment, and then she looked up and she told them everything, from the beginning, leaving nothing out. Her father and what he had done to theirs. Director Choi and the device in the bag she had never opened. The 4 months of watching and reporting, and the intelligence file with both their names. She told them she had known who they were from the first day she walked into Hanyo. She told them she had been watching and filing reports, and she told them she had not been able to complete the final stage of the mission. Because something had happened somewhere in the months between arriving with an assignment and arriving at this apartment with blood on her jaw, and she did not have a clean explanation for it. But it was real, and she was not going to apologize for it, even if everything else she had to answer for would take her a very long time to account for. When she finished, the room held a silence so complete she could hear the harbour below. Hyun-soo turned away and drove his fist into the wall. She did not flinch. She had been expecting something like that. She had been expecting worse. Jae-won did not move. He stood in the center of the room and looked at her, and his expression was the most complicated thing she had ever attempted to read. Grief and fury, and something beneath both that might have been a very controlled man standing at the limit of his control. right at the edge of it, deciding whether to step over. "Our father," Jae-won said very quietly. "The name in your phone." "Yes. You have documentation. Everything I was given. You will give it to us." "Yes. All of it." Hyun-soo turned back around and his face was wet, and she had not prepared herself for that. For the sight of this loud and physical and seemingly impenetrable man with tears on his face making no effort to remove them. And the sight of it broke something in her that had been cracking since before she ever arrived in this city. "Get out," Hyun-soo said. Not to her. To the men near the door. They left without requiring further instruction, the three of them alone above the harbour. The silence stretched, and then Hyun-soo sat down on the couch beside her, not close, not touching, forearms on his knees, staring at the floor, and breathed. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "Some part of me knew from the beginning. I felt it." "Then why?" "Because the other part didn't care." He looked at her, and there was nothing protecting anything in his face anymore. No performance, no armor. "I looked at you, and the other part of me did not care about any of it. I hate that about myself. And I don't hate it at all. Both things at the same time." Jae-won had moved to the window, his back to both of them, the tiger tattoo above his collar lit by the harbour lights through the glass. "Choi's people will come back," he said. "Yes," Zara said. "For you, and for us, because you warned us." "Yes. So we share a problem." She looked at his reflection. "Yes." He turned from the window and looked at her, and his blonde hair was slightly undone, 2 strands loose across his forehead, and in the harbour light he looked less like an expression of carefully maintained authority, and more like a man standing at the edge of a decision he had already made, but had not yet said out loud. "Then we solve it together," he said. Hyun-soo exhaled something that was almost a laugh. "Just like that. Would you prefer another approach?" "I would prefer she had not walked into our restaurant as a spy." "So would I," Jae-won said quietly, and then after a pause that contained a great deal. "And yet," he said it the way she had said it to him at the bus stop weeks ago, and she looked at him and something moved across his face. Not the ghost of a smile this time, but the real thing, brief and controlled and completely his. And from Jae-won that was enormous. That was an entire declaration dressed in 4 syllables. The 2 weeks that followed were controlled war and complicated intimacy in equal measure. Jae-won mapped Choi's operation with the precision of someone who had spent his life building systems for exactly this purpose. His network reached into the Port Authority, 3 municipal offices, 2 financial institutions used as operational cover, and a contact in Seoul whose access gave them the full picture of Choi's infrastructure in Busan. He built the timeline on paper and shared it with her across the dining table, and she integrated it with what she knew, and the picture that assembled was complete enough to be actionable. Hyun-soo worked the street intelligence, the docks, the fight rings, the port workers who owed him favors, the safe house locations and communication relay points, and the faces of 2 of the 4 team members Choi had inserted into the city. He brought everything to the apartment every morning and sat at the table with her and the city map, and ate whatever he had brought without announcing it. Containers from places he knew, set down in front of her with the easy generosity of a man who expresses care through feeding people, and talked through the intelligence out, loud because that was how his mind worked, the words needing air to become real. But between the intelligence work there were other things. There were moments. One morning she fell asleep at the table with her head on her arms, and woke to find a blanket over her shoulders and the lamp turned low and both men's documents still open at their respective ends of the table. She did not know which of them had put the blanket there. She thought about that for a long time. One evening, Hyun-soo stayed after Jae-won had gone, and they sat on the apartment floor with their backs against the couch and the harbour lights below, and he pulled her into his side and she let him. And they sat in the quiet warmth of it for a long time without speaking. Then he turned his face into her hair and said, "When this is done, you stay." Not a question. "When this is done," she said, "we will see." "No." He tipped her chin up and looked at her with those dark eyes that felt everything at full capacity. "You stay. I am telling you, not asking." She looked at him for a moment. "You are very sure of yourself." "I am very sure of you," he said, and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was warm and slow, and tasted like something she wanted to keep. One night, Jae-won remained at the table after Hyun-soo had left, and they worked in silence for an hour. And then he set his documents down and looked at her and said, "My brother chose the crane. I chose the tiger. We were 19 and 21 and trying to understand what we were made of." He paused. "I am still working on that." She looked at him across the table. "So am I." He held her gaze. "Perhaps that is something we can do at the same pace," he said very quietly. And it was not a suggestion. It was a careful, precisely worded declaration from a man who had spent his whole life being precise about things and was choosing to be precise about this. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He looked at their hands and then turned his over and held hers with the specific quality of a man choosing to believe something is real rather than waiting for proof. The harbor glittered below. The apartment was quiet. "The woman from Lagos," he said. "The man with the umbrella," she said. The ghost smile became real, and it was devastating and complete. And she understood in that moment that she would carry it with her for the rest of her life, regardless of what came after. The night the brothers fractured open had been coming for weeks. Hyun-soo said something about their father, a small, dismissive sentence that cut to the bone, and Jae-won went very still in the way that precedes something. "He was still our father," Jae-won said. "He was your father." Hyun-soo's voice was rising, years of it behind every word. "You chose him. I was assigned to him. When he died, you grieved. I was 17 years old, and I felt relief, and then I spent 10 years ashamed of that relief. Do not make them equal." "He taught me everything," Jae-won said, and there was something fracturing in his control. "And I no longer know what that means. Whether it was a gift or whether it was something taken from me while I was grateful for it. Whether I should—" He stopped. "Both," Zara said. They both looked at her. "It is both things at the same time," she said. "Everything he gave you and everything it cost you. You do not have to choose which one is true. They are both true simultaneously. That is what fathers like that leave inside you." She looked at her own hands. "I know this." The silence after was different from every silence before it. It was the silence of something released rather than suppressed. Hyun-soo crossed the room and put his hand on the back of his brother's neck, and Jae-won closed his eyes for a moment and accepted it. And something that had been fractured between these two men for 10 years moved almost imperceptibly, almost invisibly, toward the possibility of whole. The night choice. Team moved. They were ready. Hyun-soo went through the service entrance of the target building with 4 men, and the fight on the parking level was fast and complete, and fully his. Elbow to jaw, knee to ribs, a man grabbed by the ankle mid-kick and taken off his feet, another spun and driven face first into concrete, with the full weight of a body that had spent its entire life learning exactly how to use itself. He took a hit to the ribs that cracked something. He would not know how much until later, and absorbed it and hit back harder and kept moving. A man came at him from behind a pillar and caught him across the jaw and split his lip open again, and he turned into it instead of away from it, caught the man's follow-through arm, locked it high, and put him on the ground and held him there until he stopped. Jae-won went for the coordination. 3 men, upper floors, moving with the precision of a planned operation in which every man knew his position before entering the building. He found the handler in the 4th floor stairwell, and the confrontation was brief because Jae-won was the kind of fighter who does not use excess. 2 movements, a redirection, and a controlled final application of force. And the handler was against the stairwell wall, understanding completely that whatever this operation had cost so far, continuing it would cost more than any employer was worth. "Call him," Jae-won said quietly. "Tell him the price of sending men here. Tell him what it will cost to send more." The call was made. Zara was not supposed to be in the building. She had agreed to stay at the apartment, and she had been under guard for 40 minutes before she put something in the guard's tea, a compound she knew from the restaurant supply, reliable and safe, and watched him settle gently into his chair, and picked up her bag, and went downstairs and got into a cab. She found the device on the 3rd floor in exactly the location she would have used herself, because she had been given the same briefing the team was operating from, and she knew the building, and she knew the methodology. She stood in front of it for a moment, this small and terrible thing in a wall cavity behind a maintenance panel, the physical end of the road her father had put her on before she could walk. She picked it up and disarmed it with steady hands, using the access protocol Choi's people had provided her, and now deeply regretted sharing. Hyun-soo came through the stairwell door 30 seconds later and stopped when he saw her with the device in her hands, and his face moved through 6 expressions in the space of 2 seconds. And then he crossed the space between them in 4 steps and pulled her into him so completely and immediately that she dropped it, heard it hit the floor, and gripped the front of his jacket and pressed her face into his neck, and felt the shaking in his chest, and understood that this man who had never once hidden what he felt had been terrified. "You were supposed to be at the apartment," he said. "I know. You gave me a heart attack. You gave me an actual heart attack." "Butterfly strips," she said into his collar. He made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else, and held her tighter. Then he pulled back and held her face in both hands and looked at her with everything in his eyes. No performance, no armor, no distance between what he felt and what his face showed. "I cannot lose you," he said. "I need you to understand that. I am not a man who says things carefully, but I am saying this one carefully. I cannot lose you, so do not do that again." She pressed her palm flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat, fast and insistent and completely real. "Me too," she said softly. "All of it. Everything you just said. Me too." He kissed her then, and it was different from every kiss before it. No recklessness, no soju warmth, nothing that could be explained away. It was deliberate and deep, and it tasted like the end of pretending, and the beginning of something neither of them was going to be able to undo. And she kissed him back with every piece of herself. Every month and every choice and every moment she had spent getting to the stairwell. And his hands were in her coils and her hands were flat against his chest. And she was entirely, irreversibly present. Jaewon found them there. She heard him on the stairs and stepped back and looked at him. And he looked at her and then at his brother. And then at the device on the floor. And he picked it up and examined it and placed it in his jacket pocket. "It is disarmed," she said. "I see that." He looked at her. His face was arranged, and behind the arrangement was something private and complex. Not anger, not precisely. Something that required more words than she currently had. He looked at his brother. Hyun-soo looked back at him. What passed between them in that exchange was years old and would need its own time and its own space. But something was different in it now. Something had shifted, almost invisibly, towards something that might eventually become repaired. "It is over," Jaewon said. "For now," she said. "For now," he agreed. He looked at her one more time, and she looked back. And she tried with her eyes alone to say the things she did not yet have words for. That what existed between them was real regardless of its shape. That she saw him, all of him, and was not going anywhere. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and went back up the stairs. She watched him go and felt the ache of it and held it and did not look away from it. In the weeks that followed, the city settled back into itself. The February meeting was held with both brothers present and side by side, which sent a message to every watching organization that the fault line between the northern and southern territories had been, for now, sealed. Zara spent 3 weeks in methodical, thorough debriefs with Jaewon's people, giving them everything she had, every contact and route and financial thread she knew from Choi's network. And she was meticulous about it in the way that people are meticulous when thoroughness is the only apology large enough for what they have to account for. One evening, 2 of Choi's remaining local contacts tried to take her outside her apartment building. 2 men, same methodology, as before, and they had not accounted for how much she was not the same woman who had arrived in October. And they had not accounted for Hyun-soo 3 minutes behind her because he had started doing that without announcing it. Tracking her route home, a quiet and consistent protection she pretended not to know about. She broke the first man's grip and drove her knee into him, and was working on the second, when Hyun-soo arrived and the fight was brief and thorough. And afterward he turned to her with his hair disheveled, and checked her from face to hands to feet. "You were handling it," he said. I was. He pulled her in and kissed her hard and brief, and she tasted the copper of his lip and kissed him back, and gripped his jacket and felt the solidity of him, and the relief of him, and the reality of him, and thought, This is what I did not know I was looking for when I arrived in this city, with a mission I was never going to complete. He walked her upstairs and stood at her door while she unlocked it, and she turned in the doorway and looked at him. Come in, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he came in. Director Choi was dealt with. She did not ask for details, and Jae-won sent a message that said only "it is done," and she sat with the weight of that for a long while and then set it down. On a morning when the sky was the color of hammered steel, Hyun-soo drove her to a stretch of coast south of the city, and they stood at the edge of the rocks, with the wind so loud it required raising their voices, and he stood behind her with his arms around her and his face in her hair, and they watched the water together, wild and cold and completely honest. What happens now, she said. We figure it out, he said. That is not a plan. I know. She felt him smile against her hair. I have always been better at the parts that are not planned. She turned inside his arms, and he looked down at her, and the wind was pulling at her coils, and neither of them cared about anything except what was right in front of them. I came here to destroy you, she said. I know, he said, and I am standing here instead. I know, he said again, softer. I am standing here too. Both of us choosing it. That is all it needs to be. She pressed her face into his chest and his arms tightened, and the sea was enormous and cold and permanent around them, and she breathed him in and thought, Mama, look where your eyes got me. Look where they brought me. Jae-won brought her a book on a Thursday, left it on the table without comment, sent a message at 11 at night that said, Only did you eat, and when she said yes, said only good. And on a Thursday evening in early spring, he walked her to the bus stop, and at the stop turned and held out a small envelope. Formal, precise, sealed, entirely him, and his face was working very carefully at neutral, and not succeeding. There is an event in Seoul next month, he said. I am required to attend. I do not want to go alone. She looked at the envelope. Is this a formal invitation? Yes. To your own event? Yes. Jae-won. I was not certain you would say yes to an informal one, he said, and she could see the effort in his composure, and she loved him for the effort, for the fact that this was how he was built and he was offering it to her anyway. She took the envelope from him. She held it. She looked at this precise and careful and quietly devastating man who had crossed a restaurant for her and given her his umbrella and held her hand like something he was choosing to believe was real, and walked beside her in silence because he understood that silence could be enough. Yes, Jae-won, she said. Something in him settled, visibly and completely, like a breath held for a very long time finally being released. Good, he said, quietly, to both of them. Good. The bus came and she got on and looked back, and he was at the stop with his hands in his pockets, and the tiger tattoo at his jaw and his platinum hair in the spring evening light, watching. And before the bus turned the corner, he lifted his hand once, that private, precise, entirely his not-quite wave, and she pressed her palm flat against the glass and held it there all the way home. She sat with the envelope in her lap, and the city moving past the window and the harbour in the distance, lit and alive and permanent. She thought about a Tuesday in October when she had arrived in this city with one suitcase, and a mission and a name she was supposed to find, and how none of it had ended the way it was supposed to end, and how it had ended exactly the way it was always going to end, below all the strategy and the fear and the guilt and the carefully maintained distance, in the place where people recognize each other without reason and choose each other without permission. She thought about her mother. She thought about her mother's hands holding her face when she was small, her mother's voice in Yoruba warm as cloth. Your eyes are too big for trouble, Omomi. They will always give you away. Yes, Mama, she thought, looking at the harbour lights through the window. They gave me away to exactly the right people. The bus rounded the corner, and the harbour disappeared, and Busan opened in front of her, lit and living, and hers, and she held the envelope in her lap and she breathed, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely and completely present in the life she had chosen. And if this story found you at a moment when you needed to be reminded that the past you were born into does not have to be the life you choose, that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is walk into a room, tell the truth, and stand still while the world decides what to do with it, then you already know why the next story has to exist. Subscribe. Because Zara is not the only woman who has ever walked into a city that was not hers, carrying something too heavy to name, and found that the city had something to say back. And neither, I think, are you.